It's a race to the February finish line. The polls continue to change, and many Iowans are still undecided. Tonight, caucus goers will get one step closer to making a decision and get to ask their questions of the candidate.
This is a KCCI 8 News special presentation. Commitment 2020, the Undecideds.
Welcome to a KCCI special presentation. We are continuing our conversation with undecided caucus goers and presidential candidates. And tonight, we talk to former Vice President Joe Biden. But first, let's meet the Undecideds. Is the Director of Operations at Creative Visions. She lives in Des Moines and is a mother to 8 children. Adam Cook is a sophomore at Drake University. He is studying political science and has been involved in presidential politics since the 2016 election. E.J. Wallace is the Iowa State Manager for Save the Children Action Network. He also runs an after-school nonprofit martial arts program called Roots Capoeira. Angie Styling is a volunteer advocate for the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. She has a master's degree in health science community health from Minnesota State University in Mankato. And we thank you all for joining us, undecided caucus goers and Mr. Vice President. I remember the first time I interviewed you and you told me the good news is that everybody knows you and the bad news is that
everybody knows me.
So tell us what you want at this point for Iowans to know about you. They might not know already.
Well, I don't want to take a lot of their time. I want to hear what's on your mind. But I think that it is, I have 2 real passions beyond the specific issues that relating to healthcare and relating to immigration and climate change and the like is the 2 things I'm proudest of being engaged with is the Violence Against Women Act and dealing with cancer. It's become a crusade for me, and because we can do so much. And so they're the 2 things, and I have to admit they probably have been impacted by the things that happened in my career and things that I've been deeply involved in.
Okay, well, let's get started. As you know, the most important in this issue in this race for caucus goers here in Iowa and across the country is health care. Yes. And Adam has a question about that.
Well, thank you for being here, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Adam.
I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease when I was 12 years old. As a chronic and quite expensive pre-existing condition, it has affected me as a student and as a college student looking to soon enter the workforce. How will your health care plan better protect people like me than the other proposed plans? And will you select a person with a disability to be the Secretary of Labor so they can be an advocate for the disabled individuals in the workplace?
Well, first of all, my administration is going to reflect the country, and whether it's the Department of Labor and dealing with disability, or whether it is the Department of Education and dealing with education, we're going to have educators and people who in fact have been affected by disabilities. But I can't promise you there'll be Secretary of Labor will have, but I promise you it'll be a major portion of what we do at the Department of Labor. With regard to, I have a brother-in-law who has Crohn's disease and had it since the time he was, I guess, diagnosed 18, 19 years old. And my plan will do a lot, but the most important thing is that my plan can get done. There's a lot of plans. Medicare for All would deal with your Crohn's disease. But the question is, do we have $35 trillion to, in fact, pass Medicare for All at $3.5 trillion a year for the next 10 years, which will double the requirement of the entire federal budget. And so what I do is I reinstate all the things that this president's cut in Obamacare. I add a public option, and I have legislation that holds down drug prices considerably by allowing the Medicare to negotiate for drug prices with the drug companies, and they'll only pay X amount of dollars for it. That would drastically lower drug prices. Secondly, all new drugs, and there's a lot of research going on, as you know, with regard to Crohn's and other diseases. If in fact most of the new bio-drugs are bio-drugs, they are not chemical-based drugs, and usually there's only 1 or 2 drug companies that in fact are involved in the process. And so I set up a board within the Department of Health of 25 independent people who in fact will, when a new drug comes on the market, they will set the price for that drug based on interviews and how much was invested by the companies in that process. I know this is a long answer, but it's a consequential one. The other thing I do is I limit under my legislation, if you want more detail, I'll be happy to talk to you about it. I limit the amount that, you had 9% per year for the last 10 years, prices have gone up, and it's cost an 856% more cost for Medicare, for example. I would limit the price of a drug that you can be charged, the increase in the price, to the cost of medical inflation. Unless you can prove you've done something fundamentally different to the drug, there is no justification for taking a drug, I'm going to give a fictitious number, that cost $10 20 years ago and now cost $150. Actually, the numbers are thousands, but there's no justification for it unless there is something fundamentally different that's been done to increase the effectiveness of that drug.
And actually, Angie, that was going to be your
I'm sorry.
No,
Angie.
follow-up question.
Thank you for asking
that.
You know, I was a former caregiver for my mom who had cancer, so it is something that's very important to me. Prescription drug costs are very important. Patients need access to prescriptions, they need access to treatment. They also need access to new treatments.
That's exactly right.
What will you do so people like me don't lose their loved ones far too early to ensure that cancer research funding continues and increases every year, and these great innovations aren't stuck in beakers in the research labs because of lack of federal funding?
Well, first of all, I understand what you're talking about. I watched my son over 18 months die of stage 4 glioblastoma. I couldn't imagine what it would have been like if insurance companies were able to come along and say, by the way, you've outrun your coverage, suffer on your own from here on out. So to me, this is a passion. I was able to lead the effort to pass the Cures Act. Mm-hmm. After everybody says you can't get anything done, well, after Trump was elected, 2 weeks before he got inaugurated, I was able to get over 380 members of the House, Democrats and Republicans, to vote for it after the leadership said they'd bring nothing up, and 94 senators to vote for it. It had the Biden Cancer Initiative in it, which is $1.9 billion for new cancer research and $7 billion for new research in other diseases. I think we should do, I know this takes time, I apologize, but if you think about it, there's a thing called DARPA. That's a Defense Intelligence Agency, a defense research agency that sits within the Defense Department, and it's there, but it's separate from everything else. And it's the thing that's come up with the internet, with geospacing, with a whole range of stealth technology. And because it focuses on the things that are badly needed. I would set up the same thing in the Department of Health. It's called ARPA-H. And I would invest $5 billion a year. Because what's happening now is there's a number, for example, if we don't do something about Alzheimer's, every single solitary bed that exists in the United States today will be occupied by an Alzheimer's patient within 20 years, costing us over $250 billion a year to treat it. Now's the time to make the investments the drug companies are unwilling to make because of the enormous cost of many of them. So we should focus on specific drugs. We have found, as you know, some basic cures and or turned into chronic diseases, certain cancers. So when I set up the Biden Cancer Initiative when I got out of office, what I did, I had 21 cancer hospitals join me, the heads of them, and 5 Nobel laureates, and we prioritized the things we should focus on. My dad used to say, if everything's equally important to you, nothing's important to you. So focus on those diseases that in fact are taking the largest toll now on people. Liver cancer, other cancers that are out there, that brain cancers, they're really, and the one that's most important to me is dealing with cancers for rare cancers that children suffer. Nobody wants to invest in those. They don't want to invest in those because there's no money. You know, it's a little bit like the reason why when I was pushing hard to get more research on dealing with drug abuse and cocaine and others. they say, okay, I find a cure for it. I don't want to be the drug company known as the drug company. I don't want to be the drug company that's not able to make, there's not enough addicts to make me a lot of money out there. And so it's the same with children. And there are rare children's diseases that I'm going to insist that we, the federal government, invest in. And we're going to significantly increase the investment beyond what we're already doing. And guess what? I'm going to be able to get Republicans to vote for it. There's certain things that, in fact, Republicans and Democrats still agree on, notwithstanding this vicious debate that goes on. And so there's a whole range of things. If you want to ask me more specifics, I'm happy to give it to you. But it is, at every one of my meetings, and maybe one of the ones you did one town hall with me, I say, raise your hand if you lost a son, a daughter, a husband or a wife, a brother or a sister. And 2/3 of the audience of every single audience I face raises their hand. We have to act now.
How many at this table?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, here we are.
So,
Thank you very much for
Did
that
that answer your
in-depth
question?
answer.
Thank you.
We appreciate that. And we're going to take a short break right now. We'll be right back with more from Vice President Joe Biden. Welcome back to a KCCI special presentation, The Undecideds. We are continuing our conversation with former Vice President Joe Biden. And Mr. Vice President, the polls show that you have a good base of support among African Americans and the Black community. And Yvette has a question about minority caucus goers.
Mr. Vice President, on the recent presidential debate, you mentioned having high popularity amongst voters of color. However, your role in passing the 1994 Crime Act had devastating consequences and contributed to mass incarceration of Black people. What would you say to people of color in Iowa to demonstrate that you've earned their vote?
Well, first of all, it didn't increase mass incarceration, the crime bill, number one. Number two, what happened was states, I was against a provision in the bill, which some of my colleagues on stage voted for, that said that we were going to encourage states to build more prisons. I opposed that amendment. But on balance, the whole thing was overwhelmingly supported by the Black caucus, by Black mayors, by the Teddy Kennedys of the world, by everyone, because we had an epidemic that was going on, particularly affecting the Black community. Deaths were incredibly high in the Black community. And so there were portions in that bill, including the Violence Against Women Act, including the assault weapons ban on guns, including the Brady background checks, and a whole range of other things that were significantly helpful, particularly in the black community. And when I say that I get support, the vast majority, if you notice, when President Obama vetted me with 10 lawyers over a month, he had no problem asking me to be vice president because he knew my role in the African American community. I have had the support of my state as the 8th largest black population in the United States of America, and it's overwhelming. As I said, I have more African Americans who are elected to Congress now support me, and more former African American mayors of the big cities. They knew something had to be done. But here's what I do. There is Bobby Rush, a congressman, has a bill, the Bobby Rush Act. We've met at length, and he's agreed to, if I'm elected president, to add things I want to see added to it. First of all, there should be no one going to jail for the use of marijuana, and anyone who was in fact put in jail and or arrested, their entire record would be expunged. So they'd be able to answer the question, have you ever been arrested or incarcerated? The answer would be able to be no, number one. Number two, end all private prisons, end all mandatory prison sentences in states by encouraging them for $20 billion for the states to, in fact, change their laws and eliminating mandatory prison sentences. Fourthly, to make sure that in prison, no one goes to jail for a drug abuse. In that same bill, I had drug courts put in there. So we divert people who have a problem with the substance abuse to a mandatory drug practice. We should be building more drug rehabilitation centers than prisons. Fifthly, making sure that while in prison, we educate people. We educate them. It makes 0 sense to have someone in prison who, black, white, Hispanic, any background, who can't read, doesn't have a basic, teach them to read and to write. Teach trades in prison. It is going to help everybody, not just that person, but these people who my conservative Republican friends would say don't want to do that. Why would we spend the money? Because it allows them to have something other than when they're out of prison, get a $25 on a bus ticket and end up under a bridge and back where they were. They'd be able to qualify for every single solitary advantage that anyone else could apply for in any community. For example, no student, no person getting out of a prison, having served their time, should be denied Pell Grants to go to college, should be denied access to housing, should be denied access to any of the programs that exist. It's in our interest to get them in a different place. In addition to that, it's really important in my view that we make sure that when we release people from prison, that in fact they are able to vote. They're able to vote. If you've served your time, the whole idea is rehabilitation. I'd shift the entire structure, which Barack and I tried to do. When we were in office, we released on the federal prison system 38,000 prisoners federally. But you know, 92 of every 100 people behind a bar are behind bars in a state, local, or municipal prison. They're not in a federal prison. And so we have to encourage the states to, in fact, have increased their prison population to decrease that and spend the money on rehabilitation, among other things. I know that's a long answer, but.
Short answer, you mentioned Bobby Rush. Didn't he apologize for that bill, and is there anything about that you regret?
No, there's 3 things I regret about it. The thing I regret about it is the fact that there was a mandatory sentence for carjacking, which I opposed, and I opposed the 3 strikes and you're out provision that the president wanted at the time, a Democratic president. I opposed that. And fourthly and thirdly, I opposed additional money to allow states to build prisons. But everything comes down to a choice. The balance of there was fundamentally more good than bad was happening than those 3 things. The argument that could be made about the mistakes we made relative to prison populations that affected minorities particularly is the one thing I've been trying to fix since I voted for it way back in the 70s. And that was when crack cocaine came along, we were told by the medical profession, because it permeates the membrane of the brain so quickly, it is more addictive than powder cocaine. So the penalty was made higher. From the time that got passed, I've been trying to change it from, it was set at 100 to 1 difference. That put an awful lot of poor folks, or a $5 hit on the street, in jail.
That's true.
And that's been wrong. Barack and I got it down to 10 to 1. It should be 0 to 1. The exact same thing. And people should be going into treatment, not into it. So there are things that I did vote for in the past that don't relate to the crime bill that did in fact have an impact on increasing prison populations, particularly brown and black folks. And it's got to stop. And we've moved a lot of it away, but we have to move on. And the one thing about the Democrats, that we all are basically on the same page about the need for significant prison reform. And by the way, women in prison, particularly women of color, they should be afforded every single health care opportunity that they'd have outside of prison. And that's not happening now, particularly for minority women in prison. They shouldn't be there. That shouldn't be the case. We should change the way, I go on length, but you should not take a woman who has committed a felony and put her in prison and make sure that she is going to a prison 50 miles away. What happens to the children? The impact on the families is profound, profound. There's a lot of these changes we can make, and I appreciate your question. I really do. I'm serious. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer.
And thank you for that thorough plan and answer. And immigration, again, a hot topic here in Iowa that EJ actually deals with every day in his work with children.
Well, so it's a really important issue for me, immigration. My wife and I teach an after-school program attended by children from all over the world, some whose families are from Mexico or some South American countries. I'm very troubled by how the current administration has treated migrant children and families, particularly its attacks on asylum and the Remain in Mexico policy. And I'm not proud of the countless deportations under the Obama administration. Would you commit on day one to repeal the administration's so-called migrant protection protocols?
Absolutely.
And then second, will you discuss how a Biden administration would fix a broken immigration and asylum system?
First of all, my wife, who I know you're, the program you work for, my wife was the national chairman for the very program that you are a member of, and Save the Children. And she went across the border with Congressman Villa in Brownsville into the area where these mostly children and women are being held seeking asylum. We've never done that before. We've always allowed asylum seekers to come to the United States of America and seek asylum. So I would end every executive order this president has set forward. I'm not joking about that. It's all about uniting families for me. And the people who go back to school would be ICE agents. ICE agents would be fired in my administration if they hung out at schools, after mass, when people are coming out of church, doctor's appointments, because look at the crisis, because of your work with kids. The psychological impact on these kids worrying, am I going to come home and mommy gone, daddy gone? That in fact, and there'll be no one arrested and deported in my administration that hasn't committed a felony in the country, and I don't count drunk driving as part of that felony process. I would end the cages. There is no evidence at all that the separation of children does anything other than damage the children, damage the families, damage the country's reputation internationally. We are a laughingstock. We are, send me you're tired and you're, this is ridiculous what we're doing. It's abusive. It's abusive. And so and the second thing is that, generically, the second thing is on day one, not a joke, I have laid out in detail a plan to legitimize dreamers. I love these guys, my conservative friends, and even folks here in Iowa, who say, well, these dreamers are here illegally. You're 6 years old, mom says, I'm taking you across the border. You say, no, mom, leave me here. Leave me here, mom, I want to stay here. And then we're going to take that kid and send that child back. Now they're 18 years old to a country they never saw before. They were never there, no family. It's bizarre. These kids are more American than most Americans are in terms of the values they've already acquired. The other thing is that's so important, I'm going to also send to the desk, I sound like my Senate days, send to the Congress a provision that requires for the path to citizenship for 11 million Americans and get them out of the shadows, And the vast majority of these people, by the way, a significant portion of these people aren't here by crossing the border illegally. They're here on visas. They overstayed. And so I'm going to rush and I'm going to provide for literally several $billions to surge to the border the people, the asylum judges and immigration judges, to make judgments about whether or not the person qualifies for asylum or not. You know one of the reasons why the Violence Against Women Act is being held up now? Because there's a provision in the act that says that boyfriends who abuse their girlfriends, if they can never have a weapon, they can't have a gun. That's why they're not passing and going on the Violence Against Women. Look what this guy did. He said women no longer qualify if they're fleeing domestic abuse. This president, if you're fleeing domestic abuse, and the last thing I do in terms of dealing with the one thing to make a fundamental change in why the surge to the borders in the United States is to change the circumstance in which people live. That's why I was able to put together a $750 billion plan bipartisanly in the last year to provide, and I spent literally probably 150 hours all told with the leaders of the three countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and saying, here's the deal, guys. We will help you reinstate your tax system. We will help you build schools. We will help you provide for street lighting to make neighborhoods safer. We will help you going after gangs and vet your police forces. But we're not going to give it to you because you guys are corrupt. Here's the deal. We will provide money, for example, in El Salvador for street lighting that reduce crime significantly, that people don't have to flee. For example, in Guatemala, there's no electricity in the mountains. They have all this energy. We should be in there making sure that people have the ability, like the TVA in America, where you can flick on a light switch. How can you do business? Why are people staying? So what I would do is I tried to get $1 billion passed. I was only able to get my Republican friends to vote for $750 million a year. I will set forward in a 4-year period $1 billion a year to change the circumstances in Central America that causes people to leave in the first place. This president's cut it, not enforced it, and not moved it. Anyway,
all
I'm
right.
sorry, a lot.
No, I'm glad we had some time to actually hear some real answers to the questions today, and